All right, hello everybody. Took a ended up using up all my time last week bickering with Amazon about hard copies of my book, but I did manage to get some time to actually sit down and read through Dune for the first time. Before we get started, I'm probably going to do a couple of videos talking about this, but this first one is mostly just going to be kind of like a top level review. So we'll start there. But before we start with the review, I want to talk about something, a little funny bit of history between me and my friend Justin, who, we do that Wordy Pair podcast together. And this is the history of the Dune check. So it's worth noting that the Dune series has had two primary authors, right? We've got Frank Herbert, who is the original creator of the original first, 6 books. And then we've got Brian Herbert, who picked up the series after Frank passed away. and you know, what the Dune check was basically is that me and Justin would go to a bookstore, back in the day, a Borders or Barnes and Noble or whatever, right? And we would pick a Dune book off of the shelf, open it to a random page, and invariably we would find something hilarious in that page. Some bizarre use of language, some absurd piece of jargon, some, laughable set of sentences that would always make us chuckle. And so both of us, for a long time, have had kind of, I guess you would call it kind of a light, a light view of the quality of the Dune series. However, it was always one of the Brian Herbert books that we picked up. I think I'm not sure, because it was always kind of a spur of the moment, let's laugh at something thing. But I think most of the time it was one of the Brian Herbert books that we would pick up and look and open up to a random page. And so I was always left wondering whether this was kind of a phenomenon of Brian Herbert himself, or whether it was something that he picked up from Frank Herbert. And for this reason, because it was possible for us to do this, I didn't really bother too much with thinking about the Dune series for a long time. But but at the same time, knowing that what we were laughing at was Brian Herbert's writing and not Frank Herbert's writing, usually, was it made me wonder if maybe Frank's stuff wasn't quite as clumsy as some of Brian Herbert's stuff was. I mean, there's a lot of things that you can do, for instance, to make stuff sound funny. You can overuse jargon, you can use clumsy or repetitive turns of phrase, stuff like that. As a quick aside, if you're intending to write something where you use like early modern English, Shakespearean era kind of stuff, and you don't want it to sound like a goofy imitation of that, you really need to actually do a little bit of research. You should read some old stuff. You can go through a bunch of Shakespeare's plays, for instance. That's a good primer for how that early modern English worked, and then do a little bit of basic analysis about what part of speech is this compared to this other word, right? Like, thou is a subject and thee is an object. Things like that to know when you're going to try to reproduce this kind of stuff when it's not the way that you've grown up speaking or talking or reading. You might even go so far as to take a look at some stuff that was written in Middle English, right? Canterbury Tales is a good example of that. And that Middle English is not something that you or I could probably read and get just looking at it. It's very different from modern English. Shakespearean, what I call early modern English, 1600s, has a lot of stuff that we don't use anymore, but in general is fairly readable, and context clues are usually enough to figure out what is actually being said when weird words show up. But there are some exceptions to that. If you look at really old books, for instance, you'll find cases where most of the S's are replaced by F's. There's stuff like this that has evolved in English in the last 500 years or so that, is worth understanding to a certain degree before you try to reproduce it. And in this particular book, Dune, Frank Herbert does use some of that kind of early modern English phrasing in places, and he does a decent job of it. He doesn't fumble it like a lot of authors I've seen do, because they're just not. Reading Shakespeare is an investment, and it's worth doing if you can make the time for it. Not all of it necessarily, but this and that here and there. It can give you enough of an insight into how that early modern English worked and sounded, and and operated, that you can do a decent job. And I'm not saying that I'm an expert either, but I've definitely seen authors try to do the early modern English thing, thee, thou, thy, thine, etc., and just get it, hast and have and all that stuff. I've seen people get it so obviously wrong that that's comical, and it kind of is like, well, this is you didn't do your homework if you're going to sort of write this. So, setting that aside, I was worried that this original Dune book was going to be like that it was going to be, as laughable on each page as some of the Brian Herbert stuff seems to be. But actually, it was actually pretty good. Frank Herbert does a good job of doing the early modern English when he tries to. He doesn't make it, a fetish. And so, I'm, it's kind of one of those things where, because I've been getting into more about writing and writing about science fiction, that I felt like I really did need to give this book, at least this first book, an examination, and go through it and see what it's about, kind of thing. So, with that said, let's move on to my impressions and the actual body of the review. What I will say about this book is that it has a lot of really good points. For instance, it has really excellent and unique world building. There's a lot of detailed and interesting, setting elements. A lot of them are, and this is something that rubs me wrong, but might work for you. They're extremely pessimistic in general. It's a very, very pessimistic look at mankind, which I'm not saying it's not necessarily accurate, but at the same time, there is something to be said about the kind of hopeful futurism that you see in something like an early Star Trek or like Asimov or Arthur C. Clarke, right? This is very pessimistic by comparison, and it almost leads you to wonder, like, well, if mankind is just going to devolve into, these great warring houses killing each other, and everybody under them is just kind of a slave, what was the point of going to the stars, right? It's just being under, like, a Roman tyrant, and what's the point? So, that's an element of the story that is both interesting and also something that I kind of dislike about it, right? But that's a purely opinion thing. So if you're interested in that kind of pessimistic view of humanity, maybe you'll like it more. Moving on, there's multiple, I guess you would say, like, religious or spiritual or mystical influences that are packed together in very neat ways. There's a lot of this first book has a lot of mysterious things that we don't get full understanding of, which is not to say that it's like a book of unopened mystery boxes. That's not exactly that's not the way I would characterize this book. But there are some mysterious, mystical things that even by the end of the book we aren't necessarily fully understanding of. And some of them are background elements, like what is this Bene Gesserit order. We get a little bit about what they're doing and what their plans were at the very, 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 very end of the book, but you kind of are just like, well, it's like a monastery, like an order of nuns, basically, that are doing something sneaky, and there's a lot of those kinds of religious or spiritual or mystical elements to the story, elements to the characters' motivations, elements to the setting. And so that makes for a very interesting read in that sense, right? There's a lot of cool, weird stuff going on. I think that in this particular book, Frank Herbert has a really good sense of creating mystery and making the timing for the reveals satisfying. There's a lot of people who will write a bunch of mysteries and then not reveal them in satisfying ways, or not reveal them at all. We don't get so much of that in this book. We get a few things that are kind of like, they're introduced early and they're kind of a mystery throughout, and they're partially answered, but they're like background or world building elements that, hey, we're gonna probably build on these in later books if there are later books, right? This is probably what Frank Herbert's thought was when he was writing it. I'll create a few interesting mysteries that will fill out more later on. There's some interesting mysteries that are introduced at the very end of the book, or near the end of the book, that are actually like, oh, okay, this is cool. This is kind of like something that they could do something with, something that he could do something with in the next book, something that could be an overarching element of the story later on. But generally speaking, most of the mysteries that get introduced early in the book have a very satisfying arc of you kind of get a seed, there's kind of some development, there's something that that is related to it, and then there's a reveal of what it is, and you're like, cool, this is a neat element of the world that I feel has been dealt with in a satisfying way. One minor downside of these mystical elements is that they kind of excuse some rather clear foreshadowing. Foreshadowing so clear that you would almost call it clunky if it weren't for the mystical underpinnings of it. So without trying to spoil anything, there are some things where like the book is like, this is going to happen, and you're like, well, thanks, you ruined it. but like the reason that you get what is about to happen is because there is an element of foresight or prediction that is part of the story and has a like genuine place in the story. So with that said, there are some parts of the there are some bits of foreshadowing that are fun too. So we'll set that aside. Where this book really shines in my eyes is the good guys, the good guy characters. The bad guy characters are kind of flat. They're kind of like all they do is scheme about how to maintain power for themselves and build their own power, and all they do is try to kill and poison people that are in their way, and all they are these kind of repulsive human beings, kind of thing. But on the good guy side, and even on the like semi-good guy side, there are some really interesting characters in this book. Most of them are drawn from archetypes, but the trick that Frank Herbert uses that is a really clever trick is to have each character be a representative of more than one archetype and to mix those together in unique ways. We have, what's his name? Something Halleck, right? He's basically a warrior poet. And so we get interesting things from him about the art of war, and we get interesting things about him about just music and poetry and culture. That turns him into a character that has a lot of sides to him that you're like, oh, this character is interesting. I wonder how he'll think about this particular event. I wonder how he'll interpret this. I wonder what interesting quote he'll have on this. Paul Atreides is the kind of the main character. He's kind of a combination of like the child coming into the hero's journey kind of thing. He has some elements of being like a seer, a mystical element. He has some elements of taking on the mantle of the dukeship, in this empire. So he has a bunch of neat nuance to his character. His mother Jessica has a lot of neat nuance to her character. His father has a lot of, oh yeah, he's the hard and practical duke who who also has a soft side and really cares about his family kind of thing. So on the good guy side, and even and I'm not spoiling anything because they mentioned that he's the betrayer, in the first 3 pages of the book. There's this Dr. Yue character, and even he gets multiple archetypes kind of folded into his character that make him interesting. And even, I don't know, but I kind of ended up sympathizing with him a little bit at the very point where, there's a Frank Herbert does the thing where there's like a quote from a book, like a fictional book that he made up at the start of each chapter is kind of like a chapter intro title kind of thing. And one of them is like, 1,000,000 deaths is not enough for Yue. And it's like, well, I don't know that I'd go that far. He kind of was under a bad series of situations himself and kind of sympathize with him a little bit. One cool thing that Frank Herbert does that I think is worth noting is that he does a great job of having different characters compartmentalize what they know about what's happened, what events have transpired in the book. And so there's a lot of really cool tension that arises from a character saying, this event happened, this is what I think happened during this event that caused this stuff to happen, and therefore I have these conclusions that are driving me to do certain things and to act in certain ways that will go against what the main characters are trying to do, while, I'm kind of like, I believe that someone's honor is at stake kind of thing, whereas, I've been tricked kind of thing. There's a lot of cool stuff where, like, character A thinks this person is the bad guy. Character B thinks this person is the bad guy. Character A meets the person that he thinks is a bad guy, and, there has to be a thing that happens to either a confrontation or, some kind of explanation. And, they have to have evidence, and they have to kind of, convince, hey, no, this is not what happened. This is what really happened. And you can do some really satisfying things with that. I think that the solutions to most of these in this book are the tension that builds is more valuable than or is better done than the actual resolution of the confusion. Generally speaking, it's like a couple paragraphs of text where, like, oh, I thought this happened. It's like, no, it didn't. This is what happened. And then they're like, oh, okay. And there's some interesting, like, character interactions there, but at the same time, the convincing them that they were wrong is not really that hard, which I think is a little bit of a weakness. Like overall, the system is good. I like the way that these developments happen, but I think the conclusions are a little bit weak in some of these cases. Another thing that is kind of, I think, well done with this book is the different relationships between characters in a romantic sense, right? Like, a lot of books these days, they will, like, jump into the most bawdy descriptions of these kinds of interactions between people. And this book actually kind of just has the characters kind of like, yeah, this is the way these two characters feel about each other, and we're not gonna, kind of pry into their privacy, but, this is the result, and this is what happened, and, this character, wants to marry this character, and this character, doesn't believe that he or she is, worthy of this or that. And so there's some interesting stuff there that is, like, I think meaningful while being reserved and I think well written. There are a lot of cool ideas in this book, from, like, culture, in the sense of, like, oh, themes, right? But, like, from a cultural perspective in the world of the book, we have ideas of, like, being dependent on each other, honor, nobility and honor, revenge, conservation actually makes a big part, but not like. But it's actually really well handled. Like, it's like, yeah, we're going to have to work really hard, but, and we're going to have to invest a lot of time and effort, and we're going to have to, like, really suffer for a long time, but our goal is to do this particular thing, which will make the world a better place. And then, of course, another big element of the culture in this book is political intrigue. This character is plotting to kill this character. This character is plotting to, trick this character into killing this other character kind of thing. There's a lot of that in this book as well, and a lot of it's really well handled, so kind of a good thing. We have cool ideas related to religion. We have multiple influences. There's kind of a lot of Arabic and Islamic, like, linguistic influences, but all in all, the whole system that's put together is much more universalistic than that. And so there's influences from a lot of different things, including, I think I read in one of the appendices or something, like, Frank Herbert got, like, tricked into taking some hallucinogens, and I guess he brought that into the story too, because there's definitely some elements of that as well. One of the cool ideas for the combat in the book is that, like, poison is everything. Everything is poisoned. Everything that's not supposed to be poisoned is poisoned. Poison, all the good things are poison, and turning the poison into non-poison is a major element of the plot, kind of thing. Poison is everything in this story, which is fun and tricky and gives you kind of a sense of, like, is this thing that just happened going to be a bigger thing than it looks like because of somebody poisoning something, right? We have some interesting ideas in the ecology of the world, right? We have the notion of the spice. We have the desert life, not desert life, but, like, desert living, right? And so we have a lot of details about how these people are managing to survive in this very, inhospitable area. We have the giant sandworms that everybody has seen from like the movie trailers and stuff. And we have details with them, how the different cultures interact with these elements of the ecology of the world. You have the imperial people that try to kind of like wall themselves off from the ecology, and you have the desert freemen that kind of subsume themselves into the desert kind of thing. And there's some interesting interplay there, some cool ideas, some fun elements. You know what I forgot to mention? When I was talking about culture, there's this one funny thing that keeps happening in the book that I think is worth noting. So the Freemen are these desert people, and they are aware of, and they interact with everybody else. I mean, not necessarily like a lot. Like they do spend a lot of time isolated in the desert, but they do talk with people who live in the cities. They know that there's this, galactic imperium that is kind of trying to rule this planet that they're on. They're aware of the uniqueness of their culture, and in fact, later on we learn that they've actually, kind of have a heritage that spans across a bunch of different worlds over a long period of generations. They have histories, basically they've seen the galaxy to a certain degree. They've seen that their culture is unique with respect to the rest of the galaxy, and at the same time, whenever something happens, and like they're dealing with somebody, and they're like, "Oh, he doesn't know our culture. He doesn't know our culture." This is something that happens over and over and over again in the story, which is, it's good. There's a couple of instances where it's good and interesting, but eventually it kind of becomes a little bit like, yeah, we get it, right? Like any normal person would get that, like, oh yes, we have a different culture than these people, and therefore, we're going to have to explain to them what's going on and what they have to do and what their responsibilities are. And to a certain degree, they seem to be a little slow on the uptake there. So that's just kind of a minor nitpick on the way that the culture of the Freemen is handled. We have some cool, like, futuristic sci-fi weaponry. We have these shields. And then we have, basically there's two things. There's shields and there's lasguns, right? And you kind of think of the laser as a lasgun as like a laser gun, right? And the thing about them that's like weird and a little silly to me, it's cool, right? You can have these cool battles, and you have the shields that can be used to defend against like hand-to-hand combat stuff. Like you have to go slow to get through a shield, and so like fighting someone with a shield, even with a knife, is very different from fighting someone like who doesn't have a shield, right? And so like the characters have to like learn new speeds and paces in order to deal with different opponents, and that's very, very cool and interesting, I think. And then we have lasguns that are kind of, as far as I can tell, they're just kind of like laser guns. But the weird thing is this: if a lasgun shoots a shield, both of them explode. And I think that that's a little bit funny, because like, couldn't you just like point a lasgun at a shield and put it on a timer and run away? And wouldn't people be doing this? It was one element of the tech in the story that kind of rang false to me. So I don't know. Maybe you don't care so much about that kind of consistency, but it was like, wait, why didn't you just do that? Right? It's like there's this giant shield, and we got to take it down, and but we can't use lasguns, because if we use lasguns, they'll just explode. It's like, just get a really long string and pull the trigger from a distance. Like, why hasn't anyone done this? It seems entirely plausible. Now, there's an element of the story where it's not mentioned very much in this particular book. I feel like it's probably going to get handled more in later books. But like, apparently, there's no computers in this world, because all computers basically created like these AIs that enslaved mankind. I'm going from stuff in the appendix now, right? Where like there was this thing called the Butlerian Jihad, and like, basically people were being enslaved by AIs, and so they fought back, and they eventually won. And that's cool and interesting, and it's okay for that to be kind of like a mystery box part of the story that's just kind of very vaguely mentioned in the book itself. But like, and so they have this proscription against creating machines that substitute for humans, but they still have like these ornithopter things that are flying machines, right? And stuff, all kinds of stuff like that. They have, ships that go across the galaxy kind of thing. And it just seems kind of funny to me that I mean, we can't create a droid to shoot a lasgun at a shield. Fine. But we can get a really long piece of string and attach it to the trigger. Like, that's not a substitute for a human. So it feels like someone would have come up with that tactic at some point and used it, but apparently not so far in this particular book. There's a few kind of meh ideas that I think are worth picking at a little bit. So let's get into that. Number one, from a cultural perspective, this book has kind of the common epic focus on like great men and great women, and like the rest of the people are kind of cannon fodder, which is always something that kind of bugs me about these kind of stories. I mean, like I get why certain characters are more important than others, but like it always bugs me a little bit when stories are kind of flippant about large numbers of nameless, faceless people getting killed for one reason or another. And so, like, and this shows up in several places in the story, but it also is kind of like an issue with, like, the backstory. So we have this faster-than-light ability to traverse the galaxy. It's maintained by, like, a guild, which is basically a monopoly cartel that the Empire kind of, like, maintains the monopoly of that. The Empire itself is super pessimistic and super hopeless. I'm probably going to do a separate video about, like, pessimistic science fiction and why I find it a little bit kind of like I get consternation from it a little bit. I think I'll talk about that in a separate video. But like, it's very pessimistic. It's like, oh, it's this group of really awful nobles that are all fighting each other, and everybody else is enslaved under them. And it's like, is that really that much better than being enslaved by AIs? I don't know. It seems like it's pretty similar to me. But the one thing that's funny about this, right, is that they had this big war, this Butlerian jihad against the AI creatures or whatever they were, right? And yet somehow, and so like the assumption is that the AI was spreading mankind around the galaxy as beasts of burden, right? And I'm guessing now because I haven't read any other books, but like the way that I'm kind of seeing this is like, okay, so the first use of FTL was done by computers. And so now FTL needs to be done without computers. And so we have these people who are really good at like computing FTL something or other, whatever it is they need to do. But like, how did they get monopolized, right? Like, people fought back against the AIs, but if these people are spread out all across the galaxy, and like initially they don't have a way to like communicate with each other across really long distances, how do they centralize that way? It's a little weird to me. And like, it seems to me like it'd be really hard to maintain a monopoly cartel of faster than light traveling ships. Like, somebody would be like, I'm out, peace, right? And they'd spread this information around or something like that. But it's even weirder than that, because late in the book we get this hint that the FTL guild is like somehow also uses spice for its operations. Because the spice is weird. The spice is like it, how do I describe it? It gives like limited foresight. And there's a bunch of stuff in the book about people like repressing their own attempts at foresight. And then there's like, the whole ecology of how spice is produced is something that I'm not going to spoil because it's interesting and it's part of the plot. But like, you have the spice, and then Frank Herbert uses the word geriatric to describe the spice's effects a lot. It has a geriatric effect. And I don't know if he's just, because he does this a few times where his like, especially in the start of the book, his word choice or his syntax are a little bit funky, and he either gets better later in the book or I got used to it. I'm not sure which exactly. But like, to call something geriatric in modern parlance means like it is old. And so I think what he's trying to get across is that spice gives is life extending, right? It lets people live to older ages without getting decrepit. That's my guess. I feel like it was not especially clear, but that's what my understanding of the use of the word geriatric in that context must mean in order for it to be something that, like, if it makes you older faster, then clearly that's not what you want. So nobody would use it. But everybody uses it because I think it makes them live longer. So, but like, it also is helpful in helping these FTL people calculate these distances, and that's kind of weird too because the AI wouldn't have needed spice, and so they wouldn't have been mining spice while they were under the AIs. So how did they figure out that they needed the spice for the FTL, and then how did that information get spread around, kind of thing? There's something funky there, and I'm not sure I'm not sure I'm quite convinced by it. Another thing that I think is kind of meh, not really a sci-fi idea, but I'm going to probably do a video on this too, but like jargon. Jargon can be used in good ways. It can be used to have precise language to describe a thing that doesn't exist in modern reality, right? Like a new idea that you have, you give it a name and it becomes jargon. Jargon can also be used to kind of create a fake sense of mystery, where like, you know, if I just use the word, if I was really careful, right, and I was writing something, and I just changed the word grocery store to shamamalama, right? Like, you'd be like, what the hell is a shamamalama, right? And like later on in the book, you're like, oh, it's just a grocery store. Like, there's no reason to use this crazy made-up word, or even a word from another non-English language, to describe a grocery store. And this is an exaggerated example, but what jargon can often be used for is to lend an artificial sense of mystery to a story. Like, oh, there's all these weird words that I don't know what they mean, and so this must be a really deep and an intricate story. But in reality, if the author is just taking a bunch of random common words and switching them over to another language or to made-up words, then that's not actually adding any mystery. It's just befuddling the reader. And that's kind of a pet peeve of mine with jargon use. Frank Herbert in this book does not go over that line. There is a lot of foreign language bits and a lot of made-up stuff, but most of it are either new technologies that don't exist in our world. They are proper nouns, the organizations, etc. They are techniques or like philosophical ideas that are an amalgam of philosophical ideas from the modern world, and therefore can't be described by any of those particular terms. Frank Herbert does not cross the line in this book. I suspect that one of the reasons why the Dune check worked with Brian Herbert's books is that Brian Herbert dug deep or gripped in, locked in to this overuse of jargon for the purpose of befuddling the reader, which makes things kind of funny to sound. And I mean, there's even a little bit of it in this book. There's a lot of like, the obvious example in this book is plans within plans within plans. Now, this is an interesting phrase because it does it 3 times. Plans within plans within plans. I think that I picked up one of the later Dune books, and it wasn't just plans within plans within plans. It was like plans within plans within plans within plans within plans within plans. Within plans. Stop, please. Like, the rule of 3 is maybe this isn't a proper use of the term rule of 3s, but like, if you repeat it over and over and over again, it starts to sound silly. I don't know if that's necessarily what that means exactly, but that's the impression that I got. And there's even something else where it's blah within blah within blah, right? This is apparently some kind of construction that Frank Herbert liked. Fair enough. It's worth noting that a plan within a plan is still just a plan, right? It's worth note, like when I was writing the outline for this particular video, like if I had taken one of my outline points and put a small outline within that outline point, it's still an outline. An outline within an outline is just an outline with more detail in one area. And so, like, it sounds cool the first time you read it. If it's limited to 3 uses of the word plan, it still sounds kind of cool. If you go to 4 or 5 uses of the word plan, it's like it's a little bit up its own you know what. And I want to contrast it with something that I remember from one of Raymond Feist's books, because I read a lot of Raymond Feist's fantasy books. And there's I think it's in Magician Master, where Pug is describing. Pug is reciting a like a proverb about politics to someone in on the Tsurani on Tsuraniwani, the Tsurani homeworld, and he says the path of politics is a path of plans within plans, or no, not plans. The path. I'm sorry. See what it does to you. But he says the path of politics is a path of turns within turns. Now this only uses the word turns twice, and instead of being an isolated, repetitious phrase, it's actually a part of like a proverb. It's actually written in the way that makes it feel like it's something that some dude wrote down in a book of proverbs kind of thing. And that I think is a better way to do this kind of it's thinking about things. It's the poison thing from the Princess Bride movie, just more serious, right? And so this is one of those things that I think is also kind of an element of the book that I found a little bit meh. So, but to finish up, let's get back to kind of the good points. I think this book did a really good job, really good treatment of the various mysteries that are in the book. I think I mentioned this earlier, but most of the mysteries that are introduced early in the book have an arc and are explained by the end of the book. There's a few that are kind of like left that don't really have an arc. You get a little bit of explanation here and there, but they're kind of left as mysteries throughout the book, and that's fine too. You gotta have kind of a good mix of that satisfying, oh, this is what this is, and then like, oh, this is a mystery that we might learn about later. And this is kind of a neat trick, is that there's a few mysteries that are introduced right at the end of the book. And those ones, because they're introduced so late in the book, you're like, oh, well, I don't expect this to be resolved in this book. It must be something that is kind of being set up for the next story kind of thing. And that's cool too. I would say that the pacing is generally good. There was a kind of a lull, right? Like in the first half of part 2, where they're kind of like learning the ropes of being in the desert. I feel like that part kind of dragged a little bit, but then it kind of hops back up again and there's a little bit of a time skip, and things are like, okay, cool, things are moving again. That was the only real lull in the pacing of the story that I really noticed. The rest of it was like, well, pretty good page turner, And so with that, let's go to my final thoughts, I guess. Dune. Frank Herbert's Dune. Very well known, very critically acclaimed, worth a read. It's an epic story of great movers and shakers on this world, in this galaxy. It's got a lot of cool ideas. It has a lot of mystery. There's a lot of military happenings, a lot of action. There's a lot of mysticism. There's a lot of mystery. There's a lot of interesting parts of the plot where, like, intricate knowledge pushes the plot along. Characters having different perspective on things moves the story forward in interesting ways. I would say that I'm not super enthusiastic about reading more, especially since there was a little blurb in this particular edition of the book that talked about the next book, and the next book is apparently about like the dark side of Paul and power, and it's like, this book is already like depressingly pessimistic, and I feel like I don't want more of that right now. So maybe at some point the mood to read the next book in this series will take me, but for the time being, it's like, cool, I've read it, I've looked at it carefully, I've got the experience. I don't need more of this like dregs of mankind perspective of the future. It's not satisfying to me in a variety of ways. But with that said, I'm glad I read it. It's good to get this perspective at least once, and to see this, the start of what became a great series. And it's a good book. Like, even though it was pessimistic and kind of depressing, there was enough interesting stuff that it kept me going. And I read it in a few days, which is, I think, not too bad, considering it's a pretty long book. I mean, I think the book says that it was like a 215,000 word manuscript kind of thing. I don't know how much of that changed with editing, but fair enough. It's a big read, and if there's 6 of them that are about this size, that's a lot of work. So like, that's kind of a matter of taste though for me. Like, if you like depressing, pessimistic science fiction, then go for it. But as for me, I think I'll wait a while before I read the next book. I don't feel particularly inclined to like, oh, read it over and over again kind of thing. But again, that's kind of, I think, an element of personal taste. Mechanically, the book is pretty well put together. There are a few things that I would poke at, like like the amount of jargon is like right up at the line. Sometimes the the some of the language is a little bit clunky here and there, but overall, there's a lot of really cool ideas. There's a lot of really neat world building. There's a lot of really cool, especially on the good guy side. There's a lot of really cool characters that are built from multiple different archetypes, so they're interesting and nuanced and fun to read about. Um, you know, um, the way that relationships between characters is handled is mature and not like pointlessly bawdy. Um, there's a lot of cool ideas about religion and mysticism. There's a lot of cool intrigue. Learning about the ecology of the world of Arrakis is kind of interesting and unique and fun. And so, like, while I would say that this book does have a few minor negatives here and there, that from a purely, does it work as science fiction? It absolutely does. It does a really good job of creating an intricate world. If I liked the world that it created better, I'd probably be more interested in reading more of it. But we'll see. Maybe I'll hit the second book and at some point and discover that it's really, really good. I mean, like, not just. I mean, I'm sure. I think it will be really, really good, right? But I don't know that it's something that I feel like reading, if that makes sense. Because there can be really good stories that they're just not what you like to read, kind of thing. So anyway, that is my kind of top level review of Dune. I think what I'm going to do a little bit later on is. So there was a video that I saw, and I haven't watched the whole thing yet. But there was a video that I saw that's like talking about Tolkien's perspective on Dune and describing, or at least wondering why he didn't like it, because that's something that actually happened. Was like somebody sent a copy of Dune to Tolkien. He's like, I don't really like this that much, and I'm going to watch that video and talk a little bit about that. Another thing that I want to do is kind of talk about the phenomenon of pessimistic futurism, kind of in a broad sense, because that's one of the things that I think. Well, I'll collect more thoughts about it, but it's one of those things that I think turns me off from some science fiction, is that it's so deeply pessimistic about mankind that's like, what's even the point of futurism if nothing ever gets better? That's kind of my like top stupid level thought about that. But I'm going to kind of collect some thoughts on that and go deeper into that eventually. And so we'll probably have 2 or 3 more videos about my experience with Dune and talking about it with relation to other pieces of fiction. I got these proof copies of my first full-length novel, and so I'm gonna probably start shilling that a little bit here and there, but try to do it in moderation. And then I've been working on some ideas for some other stuff that I wanted to talk about. I want to read the next book of the Foundation series. I want to cover some Heinlein, and I actually do want to kind of do some rereading of Michael Crichton's stuff that I haven't read in a long time, but that was kind of one of my early introductions to science fiction books that I think is worth reading and looking at and talking about. So yeah, that's kind of where we're at. As always, thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. If you like what I'm doing with the channel, you know what to do. And otherwise, I will say thanks anyway for watching, and hope you have a good week, and see y'all later. Have a good one.